My name is Elizabeth Musa, and today we'll be taking a look at what the suspension of the Naira-for-Crude deal by NNPC means for Nigeria, with deep insight on the implementations and way forward. The Nigerian National Petroleum Company Limited has suspended the Naira-for-Crude oil swap deal with domestic refiners, which include Dangote Refinery and other private operators. Now, the decision, which took immediate effect, has sparked discussions about its implications for Nigeria's energy sector and the broader economy. The Naira-for-Crude arrangement, introduced on October 1, 2024, allowed local refiners to purchase crude oil in Naira instead of dollars. Now, the initiative was designed to support domestic refining capacity and to reduce reliance on imported petroleum products. Also, to stabilize the local currency by easing pressure on foreign exchange reserves. Now, today on the morning show, we are focusing on the determination of the deal and its implications for the local refiners, the oil sector, and the Nigerian economy at large. But to make us understand this even better, we are joined in the studio by Dipo Oladende. Dipo is a senior analyst and the head of the BusinessDay's energy desk. Dipo, welcome to the show.
Yeah, good morning, Elizabeth. Good to be here once again.
Very lovely to have you. Let me start by asking you, firstly, why was the Naira-for-Crude deal necessary in the first place?
Okay, so let's take some step backward. Last year, October, the government announced that they were going to be putting a system in place, a structure in place to make sure that oil refiners are able to purchase crude oil in local currency. Before now, crude oil is usually traded in dollars, international currency, and so what the government decided to put in place was to make sure that local refiners have steady supply of crude oil in order to meet their refining obligation. Now, why is this necessary? This is necessary because for the first time in Nigeria's history, we are seeing the refineries coming back on stream, and so that's a big deal. And one of the major criteria or a major feedstock requirement for refiners is crude oil. So they need to get crude oil on a constant basis, and so majority of the refiners have been complaining that access to dollars had been a big problem. Sourcing for crude in the international market has been a big problem, and the government said, okay, let's put a structure in place where this set of refiners can purchase crude oil in Naira. The aim of that development is to make sure there's steady supply of crude oil to these local refineries, to make sure that local refiners have steady supply, and then they can refine enough products to meet our domestic demands, both in terms of petrol, aviation fuel, diesel, and all of the other petroleum products. So that was the need for the crude for Naira scheme.
Dipo, let me ask you this question that's very important. Was there a plan for this to fail from the beginning? Because the Dangote Refinery, for example, started complaining, so to speak, from the initial weeks that it was getting, sufficient crude based on the deal arrangement. Now, the case of other smaller modular refineries was even more worse and I could say more frustrating. So, was there a plan for this to fail from the start?
I won't say there was a plan to fail, but I think just like every good law in Nigeria, sometimes we have the most fantastic structures in place. Sometimes we have the right kind of laws, but then implementation is a big problem. Now, this deal of Naira-for-Crude sale was the head of the FG's team was the Minister of Finance, Wale Edun. The head of the FIRS, that's the Federal Inland Revenue Service, was also part of this deal. And then, of course, NNPCL, NUPRC, that's Nigeria's upstream petroleum company. So all of these guys sat together and said, look, let's put a structure in place. Now, along the way, Dangote Refinery started complaining that, look, we are not getting enough that you've promised to supply us at different points in time. Now, you would expect that there should be a comprehensive structure of all of Nigeria's crude oil production. So if our daily crude oil production, for instance, is 1.5 million barrels per day, what percentage of this is used for our dollar earnings? What percentage of this is used for our crude oil production? for our local refineries, what percentage of this is used for international obligations or meeting all of our loans obligations and the rest of it. So, but we don't have that kind of structure where there's transparency among all of Nigeria's crude oil production. Some would argue that we are doing 1.4, some will say we are doing 1.5, some will say we are doing 1.6. So we need clarity in that regard, and we hope that the government will put the right structure in place to make sure that implementation is also right as well.
Okay. So in other oil-producing nations who are members of OPEC, we don't get to hear them engage in using their crude to get advanced loans. So why is this practice peculiar to Nigeria's NNPC?
Okay, so let's take a step backward. I think sometime around last year, the government took some oil-back loans. So what are oil-back loans? Oil-back loans are loans so you go to international agency or you go to international traders rather, and you say, give me certain amount of money. And what I would use as a guarantee, or what I would use to pay back these loans would be certain amounts of crude oil from one period to another period. So for instance, you can walk up to any of the international oil traders and say, look, give me $1 billion. And in exchange for $1 billion, NNPC would pledge 10,000, 12,000, 20,000 barrels of crude oil from one period to another period. They can pledge from now till next year, they can pledge 2 years, they can pledge 18 months, depending on the terms and condition of the contract. Now, this oil-back loan is a new development Nigeria is gradually growing into. First of all, it's not something we were doing before in the past. But at some point, we needed to earn more dollars to boost our FX supply. So last year, Afzim Bank was also part of this transaction that saw NNPC got about $2 billion or $3 billion, and what was pledged for that was roughly about 120,000 barrels of crude oil from one period to another period. So now there are conversations ongoing that one of the biggest challenge the NNPC is facing regarding meeting his Naira-for-Crude terms, or meeting his Naira-for-Crude obligations in local refineries, is because majority of Nigeria's crude have been committed to oil-back loans. So because a lot of this crude oil have been committed to oil-back loans, we don't have enough to meet our local refineries, and that's like the biggest challenge. So a lot of people have said, look, NNPC needs to be more transparent. NNPC needs to be more open and say, look, what percentage of our crude oil have been used for these crude oil loans? What percentage of our crude oil do you have in stock to meet local oil refiners? And then let's just be open, because for these local oil refiners, if you are open to them and say, look, we can only guarantee you 10,000 barrels of crude oil, that's transparency is clear, so they can easily source for whatever they need outside NNPC. Let's not forget that as we speak, the Dangote Refinery is currently sourcing close to 90% of its crude oil outside Nigeria. So what that means is the Nigerian crude oil is not, the Naira-for-Crude scheme is not bankable for a lot of the local refiners to do business with. It means they have to source for crude oil in the international market. And then we've waited forever for Nigeria's oil refineries to come on stream. And now they are back on stream, and then the conversations around crude oil is now the biggest elephant in the room. So hopefully, the NNPC released a statement yesterday saying conversations are currently ongoing, that the last agreement was a 6-month agreement from the 1st of October till March this year. And so we are in March already, and so it's expected that new terms will be discussed. And
sorry, just to backtrack a bit, you said from the last agreement, is that how long it's supposed to?
No. So each agreement is 6 months.
Okay.
So October last year, they signed a 6-month agreement that within 6 months, under certain terms and conditions, would guarantee crude for Naira.
Okay.
So now that we are in March already, and we are moving towards the end of March, they need to renegotiate. Everybody will come back to the negotiating table and say, look, we need to renegotiate. So what are these things they are renegotiating? For instance, what's the international price of crude oil? What the exchange rates will be used, and what's the supply chain mechanism? How is it going to be moved from one place to another place? So if all of that's being addressed, I think we should get something more concrete, and then hopefully would expect increased supply from NNPC.
You know, so many people will have the opinion, or could hold the opinion that it seems like this is a way to mortgage the future of Nigerian future generations, because we seem not to know how long these oil loans are running for or are meant to run for. Can you please speak to that?
Okay, so again, it boils back to the biggest issue NNPC have faced in recent times, which is issues around transparency. Around December last year, there were reports in the media that NNPC had took a 2 billion loan under a project Leopard scheme that allowed them to source for certain amount of $2 billion from the international oil traders. Now, the guarantee for this $2 billion was around 35,000 barrels of crude oil per day from, I'm not sure the timelines were given. But then this is it. So all of these crude oil back loans are based on future oil production. So what you are saying is you are mortgaging oil that you don't have now. You are saying between now and 2 years' time, you are pledging certain amount of crude oil that you don't have, that you've not produced, but you are anticipating that you will produce it. It's like you're going to the bank and say, look, all my salaries from next year, from January 2026 to December 2026, I'm using it as a guarantee for a loan. You've not earned this salary. You don't know what will happen. You don't know if you would even be alive. So you are just pledging future loans, future crude oil that you've not earned or that you've not produced, and then you are using it to collect cash now that you need to use to meet your immediate needs. Now, if these cash are for developmental projects, that could be a different conversation entirely. But then you are just using it now to meet your daily running expenses, to meet your daily obligation, which is the biggest challenge a lot of people have asked. That so why are you mortgaging crude oil you don't have, future crude oil for current cash, and this current cash you are using it to run recurrent expenditures, run your operations and the rest of it. So that's like the biggest challenge. So the biggest thing NNPC is facing is we've not been able to scale up crude oil production. Once upon a time, we were doing 2 million barrels per day. So if we are scaling up our crude oil production, and then you are perhaps still mortgaging all of this crude oil loan, yes, people would say, okay, maybe that's a good thing. So if, for instance, you scale crude oil production from 1.8 to 2.5 or 4.0 or 4.2, yes, that's a good thing. So even if you are mortgaging 500,000 barrels of it, it's a welcome development. But you're not scaling up crude oil production. We've languished around 1.4 to 1.8 for like 2, 3, 4 years. We've not moved from that region. Other oil producing countries in OPEC are moving their oil production, some at a geometric pace, from 2 million, 3 million, 4 million barrels per day, and we are stuck at 1.2, 1.4. So I think the biggest conversation we should be having now is how to increase crude oil production. The moment we are increasing crude oil production, we would add more value to Nigeria's economy, and perhaps we might not even need all of the loans we've been taking. And
so, speaking of not needing more of the loans we've been taking, let's talk about the larger implications of the suspension of the Naira-for-Crude deal by the NNPCL on the economy. Now, how do you think this will affect the average petroleum product consumers? Do you think this is likely to lead to higher pump prices?
Okay, so my view is NNPC is the Dangote Refinery is already sourcing close to 80% of its feedstock, its crude oil feedstock, from outside NNPC already. So if they are able to source 80% of their crude oil, and then they are still able to reduce petrol prices to the current levels we have now, then that's a good, that's a fantastic development. The most important thing is to make sure that NNPC is able to meet its obligation in this crude oil, in the Naira-for-Crude scheme. If the NNPC is able to meet up, and then Dangote is sourcing 50, 60 or 70% of its crude oil from the local markets, yeah, definitely we should start expecting maybe a slight reduction in prices as a result of these developments. But now, time will tell the impact it will have on crude oil, on petrol prices. Yesterday, NNPC also announced that since the beginning of the crude oil scheme, from October till date, they've supplied roughly close to 84 million barrels of crude oil to Dangote Refinery. Some will argue that that number is debatable. Is it true or is it not true? And then Dangote Refinery is yet to substantiate that if they receive such volumes of crude oil from NNPC. But the most important thing is, as we speak, the refinery is sourcing. All of the local refineries in Nigeria have a plan B, which is the international market, to source for crude oil. And a lot of them are dependent on that because that is more dependable, that's more bankable than our local, than the Naira for crude for Naira scheme that NNPC have been claiming to run. So in the next couple of months, it will be an interesting time. Hopefully before the end of this week, Dangote would come out to reveal more information that we don't know about this development. But interesting times ahead, and so we'll see how it works pans out.
Interesting times ahead indeed. So what options are left for the local refiners in this situation?
I mean, the option is always to Dangote have sourced crude oil from Angola, he has sourced from Ivory Coast, Senegal. I mean, all of the African corridors is knocking on their doors asking for crude oil. At some point, it was at the US and United States as well, sourcing for crude oil. The good thing about these refineries, the refinery is built to refine all classes of crude oil. So either it's light crude, heavy crude, or whatever the class of crude it may be, the Dangote Refinery is structured to refine it. So they will be knocking on all of the West African corridors, all of our OPEC member countries, and saying, look, we need crude oil, and then if you can guarantee supply. Let's not forget that this refinery is currently operating at 80%. At some point, it will be knocking 100% capacity. So what that means is it will be refining. It needs a daily feedstock of about 650,000 barrels of crude oil daily, and so that's a lot. And hopefully, it would get it from the international markets.
Right, and you know, right now what we've been seeing is higher petrol importation bills, and at a time like this where we have developed capabilities for local refining, so cases like this seem contradictory. We would have expected to see less importation. Very quickly before we go, how do you think this can be addressed?
So I mean, the issue of importing crude oil is still a mystery to most Nigerians. Most people struggle to understand the mystery behind continuous importation of crude oil despite working local refineries. Some would argue that yes, we need competition in the downstream market is deregulated, we need competition left, right, and yes. I mean, the argument is strong that yes, we clearly need competition, but though some would argue that the competition we currently need is for local refineries to compete among themselves. And so they would always ask yourself that in a period where Nigeria is complaining of FX scarcity, in periods where we have a lot of question mark about FX supply in our country, why are some set of people still hell-bent on using this scarce FX to import petroleum products into Nigeria? Some would argue that, look, instead of, why can't all of these importers come together and put all of these FX together and decide to build a local refinery that would add value? Because the big deal about being an oil-producing country like Nigeria is to make sure you domesticate the value chain of the oil and gas production in Nigeria. So if, for instance, you have the capacity to produce 1 million barrels of crude oil per day, are you refining it in Nigeria? It is when you refine in Nigeria that you can build local capacity. It's when you refine in Nigeria that you get value, because all of that value chain is domesticated in Nigeria. But a structure where we export crude oil and then we import refined crude oil products, you're just creating jobs for European refineries. You're just creating money, or you're creating a profitable environment for European refineries to feed on products that are being moved from Nigeria. So the conversation we should be having is beyond just, oh, stop crude oil exports. Let's begin to understand the importance, the economic implication of continuous importation, this addiction to imports. I think it's something that we need to win ourselves from, because the road is, let's support the local refinery. Dangote has showed us that, look, with efficient working local refineries, prices can go down, which is what is currently showing. And so let's make sure that we build a structure where the local refineries can work, and then we can add value to them. Because when they are working, I mean, Dangote announced them some weeks ago, the value of money it paid as taxes to the Nigerian authorities, which is one of the highest in recent times. So the government themselves will earn more in terms of taxes.
They will earn more, yes.
These companies will employ more people. The economy is booming, and then you add more value to Nigeria's economy rather than just exporting crude oil, importing refined products. You're not getting any value. Nobody's getting any value from that. And so we need to just wean ourselves away from that imports addiction and then move to a more sustainable structure of supporting local refineries to meet our local crude oil production, not just for petrol alone, for aviation fuel, for diesel, and all other petroleum products.
Dipo, I hear you when you say that we should, wean ourselves of this import addiction. But I must tell you that there are lots of people that will disagree with you on that one, because we've had conversations with people from the IPMAN, we've had conversations from some energy experts who have said that, importing will also keep competitiveness, that will lead to more competency. What do you have to say to that?
Look, I'm not against competition in the downstream sector. I'm not sure anybody is against competition. But what we are saying is let the competition be in-house. Let's have competition within our local refineries. Let a Warri refinery, for instance, be competing with a Watersmith refinery. Let Aradel refinery be competing with a Kaduna refinery. Let the Dangote refinery be competing with any other local refineries in Nigeria. So nobody is saying there should be a monopoly in the market, because the argument for those who are importing is that we need to make the market competitive so that there is no monopoly and the rest of it. I mean, that's a point that I don't see the value. Again, the most important thing is paying attention to value. So if yes, we are importing, what's the value? What value do you get to Nigeria's economy by being import dependent on European refineries to meet your crude oil, your local, to meet your petrol demands in Nigeria? So what that means is, if European refineries are going through routine maintenance, we are stuck. There's scarcity of petroleum products all across the country and the rest of it. That's not a good thing. The biggest way of guaranteeing steady supply of petroleum products in Nigeria is to support local refinery. Let's not forget that, look, at different points in time, issues of petrol queues shouldn't be happening in Nigeria because we have local refineries. In other oil producing countries, there's no this import addiction of importing petroleum products left, right, center. And then if you are still importing, petrol queues will always be topical. Why? Because sometimes you owe international crude oil traders. Sometimes European refineries are going through routine maintenance. Sometimes there's development from ship-to-ship movements of products that would always cause scarcity, and then people are queuing. There's slowdown of economic activities. A lot of people cannot get to work. You will not be able to get to work at different points in time. But when we support local refinery, one thing is guaranteed: there's steady supply of crude oil. A lot of marketers, either IPMAN or major oil marketers, can easily drive down to Dangote Refinery, pick up products, and then supply, compared to moving ship to Europe for products. So that's one. And then the most important thing is value. Again, I keep emphasizing on value, because we are not getting enough value from being called Africa's biggest. A lot of oil producing countries have done a lot with crude oil, and they can only do so much because they are able to get value from their crude oil. If we don't get value for it, then there's no point making so much noise as being Africa's biggest oil producing country. So that's my view.
Thank you, Dipo. Always insightful, always informative. It's always a delight having you on The Big Story. And this is all we can take this morning on The Big Story here on the BDTV Breakfast Show. We hope that you found it impactful. Just stay tuned for more.